Okay, my name is Howard Eber, and I am an alcoholic. I thank you all for bearing with us, and welcome everybody to the Big Book Comes Alive Step Study Workshop, week number 12 in this cycle. We now have a fully operational and functional website. The great Andy F. put this together all on his own. He did a spectacular job, even managed to secure the great title for it. The URL for our website is thebigbookstudy.com. How great is that? That nobody else took it, I can't understand, but we got it. Thebigbookstudy.com. That's our website. You'll find all of the recordings. You'll find all of the handouts on both the Sunday and the Monday meetings. And we're going to be expanding out. We're going to put other things on that page. But for now, basically, it's so you can get the recordings, so you can get the handouts, so you can get caught up. If you want to know previous cycles, they will still be on recoveryspeakers.com. We have about 4 years or 3 years of cycles there. You want to hear a whole cycle? That's where you'll find it. But starting with this cycle, we're on Andy's page. And I think he's done a great job. It looks beautiful, fantastic job. Thank you, Andy. It's just miraculous. But let's get to work finally. The meeting will be over by the time we get to anything substantial. We're talking about Bill's story. We are in Bill's story, I should say. And what we're trying to do as we go through it is look for points of identification rather than looking for differences. I read this story for 24 years and just could not relate to it because all I saw were the differences in Bill's life and in my life. And if I put that aside and I look for identification about the way Bill thinks and the way Bill drinks and the way Bill acts, then I can identify enormously with him. So what I'm suggesting is as we go through the book, when we reach a point that you identify with, specifically where you can relate to it, put a pencil check mark next to it. And I guarantee by the end of the chapter, you'll be shocked at how many checks you have. We're also going to look for points of identification in terms of his progression, going from drinking for fun, moments sublime, and intervals hilarious at the beginning of the chapter. And then we're going to move into his drinking to function, where it ceased to be a luxury and became a necessity. In order to function, had to have chemical enrichment. And then he drank for the sickest reason of all, the seeking of oblivion, not looking to function, not looking to have fun, just looking to get as deep inside and far away as possible. We're also going to look for examples of Bill's quest for status. Bill's searching for money, for power, for recognition, his big shotism, his use of hyperbole. And hyperbole is just intentional exaggeration, using big words when you don't need to do that. Looking for points where you think, well, doesn't he think he's King Bill of the Kingdom of Kingdom of Wilson? We're going to look for those points as we go through that. And we're also going to look for examples of Bill's attitude of don't tell me I can't do something. The way to get Bill to do something is tell him he can't, and he's going to go set out to prove you wrong. So where we are today is we're on page 11. We, I believe, got up to paragraph 3. And what we're dealing with here is Bill has had a visit. Bill has reached the bottom. He's now drinking and drugging. Dr. Leonard Strong, his brother-in-law, came over with sedatives to help him calm down. And then he started combining the sedatives and the alcohol. And he says, and this is something that very often gets overlooked, Bill said that combination of alcohol and drugs landed me on the rocks. So Bill bottomed out on a combination of alcohol and pills. So if you have a meeting for alcoholics only and don't let anybody else in, Bill Wilson couldn't come into the meeting. But be that as it may, we've gone through that, and he's really bottomed out. And the phone rings one day, and it's a boyhood friend, Ebby Thatcher, who Bill thinks was the worst alcoholic he ever met. Um, he thought, if I ever get as bad as Ebby, I'm going to have to quit. I couldn't go on living if I was as bad as Ebby. And Ebby called, and he was sober. And it meant something to Bill. This was some guy he never thought he'd see like that. And he wanted to come over and he wanted to talk to Bill. And Bill figured, great, we can drink together, we can reminisce about old times. So rather than being glad for his friend who sobered up, he wanted to get him drunk. Selfish as can possibly be, that's all he thought about. So his friend Ebby came over, and immediately, Bill was stricken. There was something about his eyes. And in other Bill mentions about how his suit was pressed and clean, and he hadn't seen that in Ebby for a long time. And there was something about his eyes. He had that starry-eyed look, the eyes are the window of the soul. And without saying a word, Bill is looking at his friend and seeing, this is not the same person that I used to party with. What is going on here? So he sits down at the table, and Ebby very coolly and calmly tells him, I've got religion, Bill. I'm glad that didn't happen in my kitchen. I don't know how I would have handled that. If one of the guys I partied with started talking to me about God, I don't know about it. But he did no ranting, and he did no raving, and he did no theorizing, and he did no preaching. He just talked in everyday language how he was about to be sentenced for alcoholic insanity to the nut house in Vermont when these guys showed up in court from the Oxford group. The Oxford group is where we came from. We were originally considered the drunk squad of the Oxford group. But in court that day, there were a couple of members of the Oxford group. And when the judge was about to sentence Bill Ebby for what was going to be a minimum 6 months and an indeterminate period beyond that to the Burlington Insane Asylum, the law was 3 strikes, and Bill and Ebby had struck all 3 of them. And you get sentenced to the nut house, and it's the judge who decides when you get out. So he could be there 6 months, he could be there 6 years, who the hell knows? But the judge gave Ebby over to these guys from the Oxford group. They sobered him up there in Vermont. They got him detoxed. They brought him back to the city. He stayed at the Calvary Mission, which was the Oxford group's headquarters. And he thought of his friend Bill, who he heard was drinking himself to death over in Brooklyn. And he decides he's going to go talk to and try and help his friend. And he doesn't call and say, Bill, come on over here, get on the train, get on the bus, come over to see me. He approaches. One of the things we do as we go through this book, is we always highlight examples of Bill saying approach. It is our job to approach the person who's struggling, the person who's new, not take an attitude of being available. If he wants help, he'll ask me for it. Well, that's why our recovery rate seems to be under 10%. Back in the day when they did approach, it was 75 to 95%, and we can do that again. We can do that again, and I think we're about to. Thank God for Zoom and meetings like this. We're getting more and more people into the book and teaching the book and spreading the word of the book, and a fellowship is building around us, around this book. So Ebby decides to pay a visit on Bill, and Bill is very much taken, as I said. And Ebby started talking to him about how these guys had shown up and that he had come along that day to pass along what he'd learned to Bill. Bill said we talked for hours. And as Ebby is talking about God, all Bill can think of is religion. I don't know about anybody else, but that was exactly the way I was when I came in here. I had such a bad taste about religion that as soon as you mentioned God, that's what I was thinking about because I didn't know they were separable. They were separate. That God and religion were not one and the same. There's God, there's religion, and there's this other thing that Bill isn't aware of yet, but that's what Ebby is talking about is this spiritual program. Religions are about practices. You want to be part of our club, you have to practice these things. You have to speak, pray like this, eat like this, dress like this, etc. Spirituality is a set of disciplines. All you have to do is have a discipline for God, for prayer, for meditation, and you get to define it. You get to say what your God is. You get to define what prayer and meditation is. And so Ebby is talking to Bill about God, and Bill is thinking about is religion. He's thinking about his grandfather who taught him that God is great, and his grandfather was a very, very spiritual man, but he didn't believe in any religions. He resented deeply being told what to do, and he passed that skepticism along to Bill. And Bill is hearing this as Ebby is going on. And on the bottom of page 10, he says, when they talked of a God personal to me, who was love, superhuman strength, and direction, I became irritated and my mind slammed shut against such a theory. And remember, we're putting check marks next to things we identify with, and I've got a great big check mark next to that because I could certainly identify with that. I was prejudiced and closed minded, and the problem with that is being prejudiced and closed minded are barriers, they're obstacles to developing an experience and a relationship with this power greater than ourselves. And when we stay irritated and our minds slam shut when people talk about God, we're condemning ourselves to a life of ignorance and quite possibly an alcoholic death. That's what the cost of closed mindedness and prejudice is. And on page 11, right in the middle of the page, is where we're going to pick up today. The paragraph that begins, but my friend sat before me. Oh, wait a moment while you find it. If you have the study version, it's paragraph number 3. But my friend sat before me and he made the point blank declaration. And please highlight this next sentence in pink because it is a promise that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed. That's all in pink because pink is for prayers and promises. But I've also underlined it. God had done what he couldn't do for himself. His human will had failed. Doctors pronounced him incurable. Let's underline incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Let's underline lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. Let's underline and highlight admitted complete defeat. That is Bill's first step, Bill's concession, not surrender. Please don't say Bill surrendered. The word surrender does not appear anywhere in the first 164 pages of this book. Bill uses more often than not the words concession and concede. And the difference is that concession is absolute, total, unconditional surrender. I surrendered plenty of times. Drinking, not drinking, in recovery, outside. I surrendered all the time. But I never conceded until May 2nd, 2006, when I finally recognized that I am my worst enemy. that every time I listen to me, I'm listening to the predator. And the last thing I need to do in any given situation is to let me into it. You know, that thing we see on the wall, think, 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 throw that out. That's the worst advice you can give an alcoholic, to invite the predator in. And that's what I'm doing. You're telling me to think, you're telling me to use the device that got me into this trouble. You're inviting the predator. Here's the predator up here into it. But in any case, let's get back to the reading. Excuse me. Yet admitted complete defeat. Then he had in effect, and let's highlight the rest of this in pink because it's a promise of what happens from working the steps. He had been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he'd ever known. That's a promise. That's what happens when you work the steps. And I'm going to suggest you highlight the whole next paragraph. We use just yellow for general highlights. And you don't have to obviously go by these colors. This is just my being anal retentive about this nonsense. But it does help, because if you want to point out all of the musts in the book, for example, thumb through the book and look for the green highlights and you'll see all of the musts. And right now, I think we're up to 143 on our list. Just like promises and prayers, thumb through it and look for the pink and you'll find them. So it's a much easier way to go through this book. So this next paragraph, these 3 lines are highlighted, had this power. Notice power is lowercase. When power is lowercase, it means human willpower. When power uses an uppercase, which is capital P, we're talking about God. But had this power originated in him? Obviously, it had not. There had been no more power, again, no more strength, human strength in him than there was in me at the moment, and this was none at all. That floored me. Bill is now beginning his awareness of step 2, beginning his awareness of a higher power. There was no step 2 in those days, but he was beginning to be aware of a power greater than human power, because he can see it in his friend Debbie. He said, that floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. And I'm highlighting the rest of this paragraph. Here was something at work in a human heart which had done the impossible. Please underline, maybe underline twice, the phrase in a human heart. I'll explain why in a moment. Let me just finish the paragraph. In the human heart which had done the impossible, my ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Underline, please, the word miracle. And if you have the study version, you have the blank page opposite it to write the definition. If you don't, you can write the definition in the margin, write it on your palm, write it anywhere. But a miracle is defined as an event or action that demonstrates divine intervention in human affairs. An event or action that demonstrates divine intervention in human affairs. That's a miracle. That's a God moment. But let's finish the paragraph. He said, my ideas about miracles were drastically revised right there. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle, and let's underline miracle, directly across the kitchen table. He shouted great tidings. Tidings, just another way of saying news, information. He shouted great news. He had great news for me. The significance here is that Eber was the living, breathing example that Bill needed. Because up until this point, and I'm sure a lot of you can identify with this, everybody who was talking to him, in a sense, was talking down to him, telling him the things he had to do, he should do, he shouldn't do. One of the things about Eber, and one of the beautiful things about our fellowship, is that we talk at one another. We look each other in the eyes and we talk to each other heart to heart, soul to soul. We're not above anybody else. So when Eber is talking to him, he can identify with Eber. And I'm going to suggest we're going to look at Andy, if you'll give me, I think it's 11.5, which is page 71 in the book Eber, the man who sponsored Bill Wilson. Let me see if I can find it here. Well, there we go. This is on page 71, Bert. You can write it down so you'll know where I found it. But Bill says, as a fellow sufferer, he could, Eber, and did, identify with me as no other person could. As a recent dweller in the strange world of alcoholism, he could, in memory, re-enter it and stand by me in the cave where I was. Everybody else had to stand on the outside looking in, but he could enter, take me by the hand, and confidently lead me out. And towards the bottom of the page, it says, while this message had shattered Bill's confidence in bringing about his own recovery, it also made him ready for the gift of release. He recalled one alcoholic had been talking to another as none other could. Eber had me ready for the gift of release. He then held out his own gift for me to see. He was the living proof of all he claimed, nothing theoretical or secondhand about him. Andy, let's take a look at 113A for a moment. This is who we're talking about. Old friends. I was thinking of the Simon and Garfunkel song from the Bookends album about old friends sitting on a park bench, reminiscing about their lives. That's what I thought of when I saw this picture the first time. Old friends. They've known each other since they were in high school. Old friends. That's who we're talking about. So Eber was able to get through to Bill because, and I love when Bill uses this imagery that he's deep in a cave, and outside the cave, everybody is shouting in at him. Lois and Dr. Silkworth and Dr. Strong and all of these people who cared about Bill are on the outside shouting, come on out, Bill, do this and do that. And Bill had no idea on how to do any of that. But Eber didn't have to stand outside and shout in. Eber had been an occupant, a resident of that cave, so he can walk straight in, walk up to Bill, take him by the hand, and guide him out. Nobody else could do that. And in taking his hand, he gave him the gift that he had himself. So let's get back to the reading. And as I mentioned a moment ago, we highlighted in that paragraph the phrase "in the human heart," and it made me think of a couple of things about the book. And I know we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but if we're making reference to the human heart, let's turn to page 55 and keep your place on page 11 and just write, see page 55. And if we go to page 55 and you look at the second paragraph, the paragraph that begins with "actually we were fooling ourselves," this next phrase is what I'm referring to. Deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. That God is in every one of us, and I believe he's in our heart. And if I then go down to the next paragraph, and the first sentence says, "We finally saw that faith in some kind of God," here it is, "was a part of our makeup." Means it's innate. If something is part of my makeup, it's there when I'm born. That this fundamental idea of God was in the human heart, and it was in that heart the day I was born, July 7th, 1952. I didn't have to go looking for God. He was right there. So when I read the human heart, there's a significance to that. Because in the heart is where I believe on page 55, I'm told that's where I'll find God. And I don't have to look very far because he's been there every day of my life. So if we go back to page 11, next to where it says in a human heart, you may want to write. See page 55, paragraphs 2 and 3. So getting back to this page, at the bottom he says, "I saw that my friend was," and let's highlight this, "much more than inwardly reorganized." And if you would please underline inwardly reorganized. He's talking about a psychic change, that he didn't just clean up and get a new suit and get it pressed and get a shave and a haircut, new spats or whatever the hell he was doing at the time. He was more than inwardly changed. And continuing, and I'm going to suggest you highlight the rest of the paragraph, he was on different footing. His roots grasped the new soil. Roots feed the tree. Roots support and give life to the tree. When I heard someone say once, when your root is right, your fruits will be right. In other words, our roots determine our fruits. Our roots determine our fruits. When your root is right, your fruit will be right. I think that's beautiful. Makes perfect sense. Now, what I'm going to suggest here is under this paragraph, you draw a line across the page, right above the sentence, "despite the living example of my friend." Draw a line across that page. And then I'm going to suggest you go down 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. The paragraph that begins with, "It was only a matter of being willing." If you all see that, the next paragraph begins with, "Thus was my convinced." I want you to draw a line across the page over where it says, "Thus was I convinced that God is concerned with us humans." Now we're going to read that and we're going to forget about the lines. And then we're going to read it again. And I'm going to explain why the lines are there. So let's go through it the way it is in the book. "Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice." Vestiges are just traces of something that has passed away, that has passed on. If you're hurt and you have a scar, that scar is a vestige of whatever accident caused it. If you light a match and blow it out and dip it in water so it's out, there's the vestige of that match still there. You can smell it. So the vestiges of his old prejudice still remained. He said the word God still aroused a certain antipathy. Antipathy is just a fancy word for dislike. Again, Bill's use of hyperbole. He wants to impress you with his language, so he uses a word like antipathy when he could just say dislike. And please highlight this next sentence. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. And I've got a big ass check mark next to that. Do I ever? I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as, and here we go with some more examples of euphemisms that Bill is giving us for the G word. If the G word, if God still bugs you and still irritates you, try these other ones on. It's like you go into a shoe store, put on the first pair of shoes called God. Ah, you don't like the God model? Yeah, I got this other one for you. Creative intelligence. Try on our new creative intelligence model by Adidas. I think you like them. Walk around. Oh, you don't like it? Okay, try this one. Our universal mind model. Or here's another one. Spirit of the universe. Spirit of nature. Different ways of saying God. Notice that each of these words I'm using are capitalized. When we capitalize something, Bill is trying to tell us, well, I'm talking about God here. So let me just complete the sentence rather than throwing phrases at you. I can go for such conceptions as creative intelligence. Underline that, incidentally. Universal mind, let's underline that. Spirit of nature, let's underline that. And we've already on page 11 run into two other terms you may want to write in the margin. Those terms are boss universal and brotherhood of man. So the ideas for words to call God are starting to pile up. You could call him whatever you like. You've been with me, you know that I kind of have an affinity for calling God Waldo, because I think the chapter Where's We Agnostics should be retitled as Where's Waldo? Well, those of you in the UK, I think it's Wally. Where's Wally? And you know what it's about. You open it up and there's this drawing with thousands of little people all over the place. And the objective is to find the little person, Waldo, in this big morass of people. So the idea of Where's Waldo is finding God. Isn't that what We Agnostics is about? Well, let's wait till we read it, and then maybe you'll agree with me. But be that as it may, here's a few terms, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens. There's another one. However loving his sway might be, I've since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. Now let's stop for a minute. And let me just review the scene. Bill is now about 2/3 drunk because, as we heard previously, they'd been talking for hours, and Bill is pulling on that bottle. Ebby is not, Bill is. So Bill's now about 2/3 drunk, and Ebby's gotten involved with the Oxford groups, this Christian fellowship, and he's using a lot of seemingly religious terminology. And like many newcomers, like many new people, he was on fire. You know, those newcomers, they can't wait to tell you all of the things they're doing, and you can't get far enough away from them. Those are the people I'm talking about. Those guys, those newcomers. And Ebby was one of those guys. He was on fire. And what is he talking about? And what is he on fire about? God. And Bill doesn't like it. Bill does not like that at all. So they're arguing, in a sense, back and forth about what God is and what God isn't. And Bill is thinking, look, I don't want to hear any more of this God crap. Really, I believe in the the spirit of the universe or some of these other concepts, but that word God, that notion of God, that other stop's got to go, Ebby. I don't want to hear about God anymore. But Bill must feel conflicted. He must feel somewhat torn because Ebby is sitting in front of him and he's 2 months sober. Bear in mind, incidentally, he's doing 12-step work with 2 months sobriety. He's had a spiritual awakening. He's qualified to do that. It's not about time, it's about work. So he sees his friend and he's torn because this is living proof of some greater power working in his life. And whether Bill likes it or not, Ebby was undeniable, living, breathing, walking, talking proof to Bill. So after all of this, excuse me, debating, Ebby must be getting pretty frustrated too. Both of them are getting pretty irritated with one another. So Ebby's getting frustrated, and his exasperation gave birth to a concept that has altered the lives of millions of people. Let's see what he blurted out in his frustration and resentment at Bill. Let's see what he said. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, and please highlight and underline the squiggly writing here. What Ebby said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? You think that has made a difference in some people's lives? Out of exasperation, out of frustration. All right, Bill, enough. Why don't you come up with you choose your own conception of God and let's stop talking about the G word. That's what the book says. That's what the book says. Excuse me. You'll see why I said that in a little while. Let's highlight the next two paragraphs in their entirety. Another great example of Bill's using graphic imagery to explain something that is just so visual and vivid. It's amazing to me. He said, the statement hit me hard. And here it is. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. Doesn't that give you a certain mental image? I have a big check mark next to it because I lived and shivered many years in this icy intellectual mountain that I had built, that I knew the answer, that I could figure out anything. But he stood in the sunlight at last, and next to it I've written, Ebby let the light in. Ebby let the light in for Bill. And like I said, we're going to highlight the whole next paragraph. And the squiggly writing says it was only a matter of, please underline, being willing. You may want to underline it twice. Being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. And underline this, please. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. To make my beginning. In other words, to take step 2. Nothing is required of us in step 2, but to be willing. We don't have to know. Later on, when he wrote the step, it doesn't say came to know. It doesn't say came to have faith. It says came to believe. And believe means hope. So what Bill is saying is that all he has to have is willingness, hope to make a beginning. And I got a big check mark next to that because I didn't have to have faith. Everyone told me I had to have faith. I didn't have it, but I did have hope. And I found out that hope means belief. Faith is conviction. Faith is certainty. Hope is belief. Well, belief is hope, rather. Okay. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw that growth could start at that point upon a foundation, an underlying foundation, if you will, of complete willingness. I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And after that, I've written, if he could, just maybe I could too. And that's what Bill is thinking. If Ebby, the worst alcoholic I ever met, can do it, just maybe, not certainty, but just maybe I could do it myself. Now, I suggested that you underline the word foundation because Bill is about to do something. Andy, if you'll put up 4.8, Bill is going to be building over the course of the next few chapters a spiritual arch that looks like this. And the foundation, he just told us about the first part, you build something on a foundation. And he's saying willingness was that foundation that everything was built on. And shortly, he's going to tell us that belief, step 2, is the cornerstone. I'm not a mason, but I understand a cornerstone is the stone that keeps a structure plumb and level, that if it's not accurate, the rest of the structure will be unstable. And that's the cornerstone. And then he builds the other stones up, steps 2, 3, 4, and so on. So steps 5, 6, 7, and so on. And then the top of the arch, that keystone, that almost triangular stone that keeps the structure from collapsing onto itself. That structure that over the years gives it more and more strength by the pressure it applies to the other stones. That is the keystone. That is step 3, because step 3 is the way we enter this world. It's the decision to pursue a course of action. And as he says on page 62 at the bottom, the triumphant arch through which we pass to freedom. And on page 75, he says, we're building an arch through which we shall walk a free man at last. We have just taken the first part of that in the foundation of willingness. All of these things, incidentally, should be in your email. If you don't have it, just ask me for it. Just send me an email and I'll send it to you. But we're going to be seeing that spiritual arch a lot, a lot. Excuse me. So, why next we have a line drawn? Why do we have a line drawn? Well, what if I told you that in the original manuscript, the 3 paragraphs that we just read, 1, 2, 3, 4, excuse me, those 4 paragraphs weren't in the book. They were not in the book. So the line, why don't you choose your own conception of God, was not in the original version. Do you think we would have a different book? Do you think we would even be here? That opened up the door for millions of people, that notion. So why was it left out? How did it get included? Well, One of the handouts, Andy, if you'll put up, is 123, which takes a lot of information from Bill Shaberg's book. But let's talk about it. Let's review the scene before the quote appears. As I said before, Bill is drunk, having been drinking throughout the course of the conversation. Ebby's gotten into the Oxford groups. He's on fire. He's talking about God, and Bill doesn't like it. They're arguing back and forth, and Bill says, don't give me any more of this religious crap. I believe in some spirit of nature, but not in that other stuff. And if we jump down a little bit, it says, so after all of this debating, Ebby must have been pretty frustrated and worn out. And according to what Bill wrote on page 12, that exasperation gave birth to a concept that has altered the lives of millions of people. But did Ebby actually say that? No, he did not. Think about it. Bill was a salesman and a promoter. In fact, in the early days, when someone with some sobriety spoke at an open meeting that was attended by newcomers, it was called a pitch, like a sales pitch. When you're talking to newcomers, they call it a pitch. And as Bill states in the original manuscript of How It Works, and we'll get there, the book was carefully designed to sell certain pertinent ideas. Remember, what Bill is doing in this book is he is selling a recovery program. Thank God for what he did, but let's remember he was selling a book that was going to pay for a chain of hospitals, a chain of missionaries. It was to raise money. Bill was selling something. So as it says here, the point that Bill was trying to sell us something must be kept in mind. When interviewed later, Ebby said he had no recollection of making that suggestion to Bill, that such a proposal would have represented a major deviation from the Oxford Group message of belief in and reliance on Christ, a philosophy into which Ebby had been staunchly indoctrinated during the past few months. As for Bill's recollection, we must remember that by his own admission, he was teetering on the edge of alcoholic insanity, therefore not the most reliable of narrators. Between Ebby's visit and the time the book was written, Bill had formulated some clear-cut ideas of what alcoholics would and would not sign on to. The Akronites were having tremendous success with a very Christian-oriented approach and seemed content to maintain their ties with the Oxford group. Wilson, the visionary, knew better and was committed to a non-Christian book and a far more open-ended, choose-for-yourself spirituality. This being very reminiscent of what he was taught by the man who raised him, his maternal grandfather, Gardner Griffith. Remember when we talked about Gardner? Bill said his contempt of some church folk and his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen. His quest to those ideas was aided His quest to sell those ideas was aided by the burgeoning membership in Cleveland, where sobriety czar Clarence Snyder strongly supported the split from the Protestant Oxford group and a less dogmatic tone for the book. So the mind-blowing, gate-widening suggestions, why don't you choose your own conception, almost certainly came from the mind of Bill Wilson and not from the mouth of Ebby Thatcher. As further proof, consider the fact that page 12's paragraphs 1, 2, 3, and 4, as we just mentioned, were not in the original manuscript. And if you look at the next page, it is the original manuscript. You see the first paragraph, just like it is on your book, in your book starts with, I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. He was on different footing. His roots grasped a different soil. You see that on your book? But in your book, the next paragraph says, despite the living example. In the original manuscript, it just said, thus was I convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. At long last, I felt, I believed, etc. This is what we're going to be reading next, the paragraph that's underneath that line. And what you have is, it was boxed in, and next to it in the left corner, there was a note written by Hank Parkhurst that said, insert number 1. And if you turn to the next page, you'll see Hank Parkhurst's notes for what should be inserted in that spot. After it says his roots grasp new soil, he says, despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. And you could read it all the way down to the end of the page where it says, underlined, why don't you choose your own conception of God? These were notes written by Hank Parkhurst, not by Bill, given over to Bill. And then he continues by saying exactly what you have in the next paragraph. That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I stood, etc. It was only a matter of being willing. These are notes written by Hank. Now, does that mean that Hank came up with the concept of a power greater than yourself? No, it does not. Because Hank worked with Bill. They sat in the same office and discussed these things over and over, and Bill used that expression many times. Jim Burwell, who also worked in that office, who has claimed responsibility, he claims he came up with the terminology. But the point being, Hank reminded Bill of that, and Bill put it in the book. And Eber, when he talked about it, even as soon as the book was published, if you listen to some of Eber's early talks, he says that this stuff that Bill talks about at the kitchen table didn't happen the way he describes it. And he says, remember, there were 2 people talking. One of us was sober, and one of us was drunk. And it's the drunk guy who we're relying on for the information. And Eber also says, but it doesn't matter who said it. The important thing is it's in the book, and it saved millions and millions of lives. Now, we're going to get into some more of these differentiations between how the book was written and how it eventually was published, especially when we get into how it works. In fact, I hope probably at that time to have Bill Shaberg come in and talk to us. He did last cycle. I'm hoping he'll come again. And when I keep mentioning it, if you're not familiar with it, you need to go out and get this book, Writing the Big Book, The Creation of AA by William Shaberg. There's the cover. It's a big book. It's a bigger big book than the book he's writing about. It's about 900 some odd pages. The last couple of 100 pages are all footnotes. Every statement he makes in this book is verified at the back of the book. And if you've ever heard Bill Shaberg, you know he's not full of crap. He spent 9 years researching this book, and it shows. So we're going to be spending a lot of time in talking about what's in the big book and what Bill Shaberg found out about the big book. But you should pick up this book, and even if you don't read it all, read the first chapter. The first chapter is called Challenging the Creation Myth. It's a reference book. You can read any chapter on any chapter in the book. If you're reading about There's a Solution, read about that in here. You want to read about Two Wives? Read about that in here. It's an extraordinarily helpful book. And I think that's where we're going to leave it today.